So unfortunately, we just got some bad news. Xdefiant will be shutting down, but there's a lot of weird things surrounding this announcement, and to be completely honest with you, none of this makes any sense. So in today's video, I'm going to be explaining the real reason Xdefiant is shutting down, and no, it's not any of the criticisms of the game, which we'll get into in a little bit, but I'll do a deep dive into where the game fell short in a separate video. Before we talk about Xdefiant, I want to dive into some details about Ubisoft that will explain a lot about what's going on. Now, it's no secret that Ubisoft has been struggling to fight the downward trend for the last, I don't know, decade probably. I mean, what was their last decent game that people actually liked? Maybe an Assassin's Creed game? But I want to take a look at a few games on the Ubisoft roster that released this year and just how much money they've been bleeding as a company. First, we have a game that dropped in January of this year, Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown. Now, I'm not super tapped into games outside of multiplayer shooters, but I've literally never heard of this game ever. So if you guys know this game or you've played it, please explain it to me in the comments section. But let's take a look at how well this game did when it released. Prince of Persia has sold about 1 million copies to date, far below internal expectations for the game. Now, if Ubisoft had planned and budgeted for substantially more sales, what do you think they spent on development and marketing for the game? Well, let's take a look, shall we? Now, I couldn't find any public record of how much Ubisoft actually spent to develop this game, but I did get an average of how much is typically spent on AAA level games. It looks like the range is somewhere between $60 to $80 million, and that sometimes those figures also include marketing budgets. So for simple math, let's just call it $60 million on the low end, just to give this game a little bit of hope for Ubisoft. Let's do some quick math here. Let's assume that all 1 million copies sold were at the full retail price of $40. That means so far this year, they've only brought in $40 million in revenue. So if we're being extremely generous and assuming the development budget was on the low side of $60 million, includes their marketing budget, and that every copy of the game was sold at full price, we're staring down a $20 million loss so far. And none of that includes the ongoing cost of marketing, Steam taking their cut of the sale, or any of the overhead costs that they incurred just from existing as a business. So already that's starting to look pretty bad. At this moment, Ubisoft is reportedly worth about $1.9 billion. So a $20 to $30 million loss isn't the worst, but it's definitely not great. Keep in mind, this is only the first game that came out in January of this year, and sometimes game development is a lot like angel investing. You spread your money across multiple investments knowing that most of them will lose money, but the one that does make money makes so much money that it covers all of the other losses and then some. But let's keep going, shall we? Next, we've got Skull and Bones. Again, a game I've never heard of outside of reporters and blog sites talking about how poorly the game performed. Let's do a quick search around the internet and see what we can find about this game. It looks like sources are reporting that Skull and Bones costs anywhere from $650 to $850 million to develop. Damn, Ubisoft. That's almost half their entire company's net worth. Surely if they're willing to risk that much money to create a game, they must be really confident that it's going to do well and make them a bunch of money.
And it's gone.
What?
It's gone. It's all gone.
Wow, those are some bad reviews, especially since they've had months to make updates and changes to the game. I can't find any reliable data on how many copies were sold, but let's just make some assumptions to get an idea of what's going on. So I found a lot of sources claiming that the game only had 850 players during launch, which was dramatically underwhelming for them, and a lot of those players were just checking out the free trial. But again, let's cut them some slack for simple math, just to see what's going on here. If we assume all 850,000 people paid the full $70 price tag for the game and didn't refund it after realizing how bad it was, that leaves them just shy of $60 million in revenue. Even if the development costs of this game were on the low end of $650 million, that still leaves Ubisoft with more than $500 million in revenue to recover before breaking even on this project, let alone making money. Honestly, this might have been the nail in the coffin for the entire company right there. Are you starting to recognize a pattern yet? Let's go over one more release this year and then we'll get into Xdefiant. Now, we can't talk about Ubisoft's failures this year without talking about Star Wars Outlaws. In theory, it should be actually pretty simple to make a decent Star Wars game. I feel like as long as the game gives fans some part of the Star Wars universe to play and explore and doesn't completely bore them, the game should be okay. We've seen countless Star Wars games over the years that have been mediocre and performed just fine, with the exception of EA and Star Wars Battlefront. So let's see if we can get an idea of just how much Ubisoft spent developing Star Wars Outlaws. It looks like the reported number is anywhere between $200 and $300 million. Again, not sure if this is with marketing budget baked in, but let's assume it is. Let's just give them the benefit of the doubt. And by the way, if those numbers we're pulling don't include marketing, then it's starting to look even worse for Ubisoft, and I'm honestly confused as to how they're even operating as a company. Let's take a look and see what we can find for sales numbers. So I found one report that suggests they've sold around 850,000 copies of the game. But you know what? I feel bad, so I'm just going to round that up to a nice even 1 million copies of Star Wars Outlaws sold. If we assume everybody paid the full price tag for the standard edition of the game, that gives them $70 million in revenue. And again, if their development and marketing budget was only $200 million on the low end, they still have a massive $130 million deficit to close. I suspect they're in the hole much more than that because we haven't even taken into consideration things like discounts, refunds, transaction fees, or any other costs that you incur in the business. So we've established a clear pattern for Ubisoft here, and if we take a look at their stock price, we can see a similar downward trend over the last 5 years, peaking at around $22 per share during 2020 and dropping all the way below $3. All right, now that we've got that out of the way, what does any of this have to do with Xdefiant? Well, when I first saw the news on Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it, that Xdefiant was reportedly shutting down, it just didn't make sense to me. Does Xdefiant have its issues? Yeah, absolutely, but so does every other AAA first-person shooter game. On top of that, Xdefiant was building up to a massive Season 3, its biggest content update yet, and with it, many of the changes and features players have been waiting for. And what would tilt the odds even more in their favor is that after New Year's is pretty much the downtime for Call of Duty when everyone has exited the honeymoon phase and is either bored or just looking for something new to try. So why announce the shutdown of Xdefiant now instead of waiting until after Season 3 and seeing what the player response is? I can't tell you how many times I've seen online or talked to people who like the game but were just patiently waiting for more updates and content. The main two things that I see people talking about and asking for in the game are a progression or prestige type system and more maps. Now, I know people love to complain about the netcode, but to be honest with you, the connection in netcode is just fine and it has been for some time. Complaining about the netcode is just something these weirdos online who've never played the game after the first week just love to repeat over and over. Meanwhile, Call of Duty can launch with constant packet bursts and people hardly complain about it. So much so that people are more willing to believe that skill-based damage is actually in the game rather than say that Call of Duty has a connection or netcode issue. But let me get back on topic here. So the news drops that Xdefiant will be shutting down in probably the weirdest way I've ever seen a game shut down. New players can no longer join or sign up for the game as of December 3rd. However, the servers will remain active until June of 2025. I guess that's great for those of us who still want to play when Season 3 and 4 drop, but why would you shut down new registrations and downloads for the game if you're just going to keep the servers up for 6 more months? I don't know what costs are associated with bringing new players on, but it seems like you're cutting off the supply of new players right before the game is about to hit its stride. Keep that thought in the back of your head for a minute. Remember, Ubisoft is literally hemorrhaging money and probably has been for the better part of 5 years. Xdefiant does have a unique hurdle to get over for Ubisoft, and that's because it's a free-to-play game. Xdefiant had been in development for roughly 3 to 4 years, going through wireframes, prototypes, and even getting rebranded at one point, dropping the Tom Clancy branding. From what I can gather online, it looks like the budget for the game was somewhere around the $80 million mark. Now, for a standalone free-to-play game, that's quite a lot, but pair that with the fact that this is completely new and doesn't have years of brand recognition and trust like Battlefield or Call of Duty, and people already don't trust Ubisoft because they've botched their releases over the last years, and Xdefiant had a very limited marketing budget to spread the word. You can see how this was an uphill battle from the start. When you compare that to something like Apex and Call of Duty, those games already have quite a bit of assets and systems developed that they can use in the free-to-play game. While Xdefiant did have a lot of Ubisoft games to pull content from, essentially all of these assets in first-person shooter systems had to be created from scratch, which may explain why the development cost was so high. Now, that's not to say this was always a losing battle, but it definitely seems like a series of unfortunate events, both for developers and the fans of Xdefiant, myself included. There are exceptions to this rule where free-to-play games generate millions of dollars overnight, like Apex and Warzone, but again, those games are built around brands that people already are familiar with and already trust. Now, you could say that people are already familiar with parts of Xdefiant that pull from Splinter Cell or Far Cry. Okay, fair enough. However, I think most people saw Xdefiant as a totally new project, as well as Ubisoft's recent track record, and said, yeah, I'm gonna wait and see how this plays out. So let's assume we lived in a world where Xdefiant wasn't shutting down next June. How long would it take for the game to turn a profit and actually be an asset to Ubisoft instead of a liability? Well, because I couldn't find good data on how long it takes free-to-play games to become profitable, I asked AI to see what it would say. And the answer that it gave me is that on average, it can take anywhere from 2 to 3 years for free-to-play games to start earning a profit. Now, if we look back on all of the tweets, replies, and statements from Mark Rubin, the executive producer for Xdefiant, he stated multiple times that Xdefiant is in it for the long haul and the goal is to continue improving the game and build over time. And it's very obvious this was their plan if you paid attention. This might have also been part of the problem, but that's a topic for another video. If you paid attention to how they were making changes to the game and their content schedule, they were very focused on always consistently improving, making things better, and adding more content to build the game up over time. They even stated very clearly up front that the goal was to release one new map every single month for the entire life cycle of the game. If you ask me, that would have been fine if they front-loaded the game with a little bit more content instead of just launching with the same things we already had seen in 3 different rounds of the beta. But oh well. If I had to guess, with the amount of money and time Ubisoft put into this game, they probably had an internal goal of becoming profitable around the 1.5 to 2 year mark, mark, which probably ended up getting pushed to the 1 year mark considering they broke every single internal goal for the game when it launched, which just adds to the pile of things not making sense here. When we put all this together, it's pretty clear Xdefiant was on the path to success, at least for its intended audience. You can never please the losers who have Stockholm Syndrome and do nothing but play Call of Duty all day while also complaining about the game non-stop. Unfortunately, we can make a pretty educated guess here and say that Ubisoft literally didn't have the money or even the ability to take on short-term debt to hang on to Xdefiant long enough for it to start turning a profit. Even more proof of this is that Ubisoft stock was temporarily suspended for trading as there were talks of a buyout on the table, and now we have even more news of Ubisoft potentially going private and auctioning off their IPs or games. So for all the people who are saying, "I told you so," or "I knew it would happen," you're still wrong. The game isn't shutting down because it wasn't a good game, which, by the way, saying if the game was good, it wouldn't be shutting down, it just shows how little you understand about the world and how it works. So if you think you're making a point, it's just showing the rest of us who actually have brains how dumb you are. I really do hope something happens to Ubisoft because they've taken loss after loss after loss, and at some point leadership needs to be held accountable. And at what point do you realize you don't know what you're doing? But on the bright side, I do actually think Xdefiant has some hope if the company gets bought or Xdefiant gets sold to the right person. I've said it before and I'll say it again, but the game absolutely has legs and staying power to become a real competitor in the first-person shooter scene. It doesn't have to quote-unquote kill Call of Duty. I wish people would stop saying that, but it would very easily always have a steady player base and be a safe haven for fans to return to when Call of Duty's back on their bullshit. If you were sick of immoral, manipulative matchmaking, or during a year where you just don't like Call of Duty. If you like that video and you want to watch another one, click here.